For my Discovery presentation, I'm going to be talking about Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. I think it's important first to look at Mary Shelley herself, and especially around the many queer individuals that may have surrounded her in her lifetime. Mary Shelley was born Mary Wollstonecraft Goodwin, and both of those names are rather important to 18th century history. Her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, was a famous author and women's rights activist who is often credited as starting the modern-day feminist movement. She is most known for her work A Vindication of the Rights of Women, which argued that women were not inherently inferior to men, but that they only seemed to be due to the limitations placed on them by men in society. She died only 11 days after her daughter's birth, and was thought to possibly be bisexual due to a very close relationship she had with a female friend who she even wrote a book about after her death. Her father was William Goodwin. William Goodwin was a famous philosopher during the late 18th century, and he is most known for his arguments about free love and his relatively liberal for the time views on sex. Her husband, Percy Shelley, was a famous poet best known for his work Ozymandias and Prometheus Unbound. He was also an advocate of free love, and was surprisingly against the institution of marriage, despite the fact that he married 2 times. And Percy Shelley was also believed to be gay, or at least bisexual, due to a number of reported relationships he had with men during his lifetime, and through the analysis of some of the themes of his poetry. So let's talk about Mary Shelley herself. Mary Shelley was born in 1797. In 1814, at the age of 17, she carried out an affair with Percy Shelley. And 1 year later, at the age of 18, she was pregnant with her and Percy's child, but that child was born prematurely and ended up dying soon after. And then, the following year, and at the age of 19, she actually marries Percy. And it's important to note that she became pregnant with their child before marrying him, and while carrying out an affair with him, which is relatively scandalous for early 19th century. A year later, the same year, in 1816, she and Percy and a bunch of their writing friends went to stay in the Geneva Mountains, where a blizzard kept them inside their estate. And they decided that it would be a fun idea to write a number of scary stories and see who could make the scariest story. And at first, Mary was lost for an idea, but after a conversation between the group about the recent scientific theory of galvanism and the meaning of life, she had a nightmare that became the inspiration for Frankenstein. And over the next 2 years, she wrote and eventually published in 1818, at the age of 21, Frankenstein, which is often thought to be her masterpiece. Over the course of the next few years, Mary Shelley ended up losing 2 more children, with only one of her children surviving. At the end of 1822, at the age of 25, Mary's husband Percy drowns in an accident. She continued her literary career until her own death from a brain tumor in 1851, at the age of 53. There is a widely held theory that Mary Shelley herself was actually bisexual. This mainly is due to both the writings and themes found in Frankenstein, and with the fact that after the death of her husband, Mary wrote several letters to her sister-in-law, in which she often described a want for the company of women, and often used sexually explicit terms to express her desire for the company of a woman. And she even sought to run off to Italy with one of her quote-unquote friends, Jane Williams. So let's talk about the novel itself and Frankenstein's legacy in the modern world. Frankenstein, to this day, remains a renowned piece of Gothic literature, and perhaps one of the most famous examples of Gothic literature, perhaps only rivaled by works such as Dracula. It is also credited as being the very first science fiction novel, and Mary Shelley is often credited herself as creating the science fiction genre. And as evidenced by this PowerPoint alone, this book is still being read and taught over 203 years after its publication. It was estimated to have sold 7,000 copies over the course of Mary Shelley's lifetime, and it can be surmised that afterwards, in the 150 odd years that has passed, that number has only increased wildly. And Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is the basis for, depending on who you ask, anywhere from 31 to 121 to hundreds of different adaptations, whether it be film or movies or television. So let's get into the story of Frankenstein. Frankenstein has many themes, such as playing God and whether or not humans should try to create life. It also focuses on the world's movement towards science rather than religious thought. It also talks about Galvanism, which was a relatively recently and short-lived scientific theory about how to create life that heavily inspired the portrayal of this story. It also heavily delves into what it means to be alive and whether being alive is even worth it at times. And as I'm going to show you today, there's the possibility that there is also a deep-seated theme of homosexuality and homosexual desires in Frankenstein. So Frankenstein is the story of Victor Frankenstein, who was a young, rich noble who had a very curious mind, and after going to college became obsessed with the idea of creating life. And so, through that obsession, he ended up creating his creature. In modern day being known as Frankenstein, however, that's a misnomer, and he is referred to as the monster or the creature in the book. And through Frankenstein's monster, we see a number of ideas explored, such as what it means to be alive, what it means if life is even worth living, and whether the creator of a life should be responsible for the actions of that life. It is also the story of those whose lives were utterly destroyed and often taken from the conflict between Victor and his monster. So, what are the homosexual subtext and themes that are throughout this book? Well, a very notable thing to start off with is Victor's relationship with women throughout the text. He almost never actually speaks to a woman, and at very few times does he even really describe women in his speeches. Victor and his friend Clerval have a suspiciously close friendship that we have seen before in LGBT works as a substitute for a homosexual relationship. And when looking at Victor's creation of life, it's important to note that Victor didn't just create life, but he created a man. He could have easily have decided with this new ability to create a woman, a perfect partner, but he instead chose to make his ideal version of a man. And when we first see Victor's creation, Victor describes his creation as beautiful. He says that he set out to make a beautiful and ideal man. And only after he looks into the monster's eyes and realizes what he has done does he freak out. And this has often been interpreted as the monster representing the ideal man for Victor and Victor's quest as an action of creating a perfect partner, as a way to deal with his own homosexual desires. And once he sees the monster and really looks at him and realizes what he did, he's disgusted by it. And this moment brings to mind a scene from Giovanni's room where David looks at the naked body of his friend and realizes what he's done and reacts with disgust. And the monster haunts Victor until the day of his death. The monster is very much an inescapable fact of Victor, much like being gay or LGBT is to people. It doesn't go away, and if you don't deal with it, it will haunt you forever. So, our story is told from the perspective of an Arctic explorer named Robert Walton. It is through Walton that Victor tells the story of his creation and its downfall. And it's worth noting that Mr. Walton is excessively feminized by Shelley, in stark contrast to the typical depiction of an explorer type man during those times as being very rough and very quote unquote manly. Mary instead chooses to feminize him, and there is this passage at the beginning when he is writing to his sister that is very telling. I have no friend, Margaret. When I am glowing with the enthusiasm of success, there will be none to participate my joy. I desire the company of a man who could sympathize with me, whose eyes would reply to mine. You may deem me romantic, my dear sister, but I bitterly feel the want of a friend. And many scholars have interpreted this as not just a want for friendship, but a want for male companionship in a sexual manner. Then we move on to the relationship between Victor and Clerval. Clerval is Victor's childhood and lifelong best friend, and the single nicest person who's ever lived. Victor is often portrayed Clerval is often portrayed as Victor's foil and someone who makes him better by being around, which is a characteristic that's often saved for romantic couples in literature. Throughout the book, Victor describes his relationship with Clerval in very dramatic tone, more dramatic than he describes his relationship even with his fiancée Elizabeth. And these descriptions are filled with sexual descriptions and innuendos. In one scene towards the middle of the book, Clerval is depicted as taking care of a sickly Victor and nursing him back to health, which is a role that at that time would often be thought of as a role of a wife or a woman, further strengthening the idea that they are a couple. And what's really telling is Victor's reaction to the death of Clerval by the hands of his monster. When he finds out that Clerval has been killed, Victor enters into shock and a 2-month-long coma. And compare this to when he realizes the death of his wife, his fiancée Elizabeth, to which he is reasonably upset, about as much as anyone would be when your monster destroys your fiancée. But it is notably more subdued than his reaction to Clerval's death, which suggests that he cares more for Clerval than he does for his fiancée Elizabeth. And then the relationship between Victor and the monster is where things get very complex.